Welcome to Crazy History. The Imperial Guards found him hiding in the abandoned villa's wine cellar, clutching a small vial of poison in his trembling hand. This wasn't some common criminal or political rebel. This was Sporus, barely 20 years old, once the Empress of Rome, about to take his own life rather than face what the new emperor had planned for him in the Colosseum. But to understand why death seemed like mercy compared to what awaited him, we need to go back 3 years to when a grieving half-mad emperor first laid eyes on a teenage boy who looked exactly like his dead wife. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of Roman excess. It's the most disturbing case of identity theft in human history, where the thief didn't steal a name or fortune, but an entire person's existence, surgically erasing one life to resurrect another. And the most terrifying part, everything I'm about to tell you comes from official Roman records. Rome 65 AD. The most powerful man in the world has just become a murderer, not through war or execution. Those were everyday occurrences in the empire. No, Emperor Nero had just killed his pregnant wife, Poppaea Sabina, with his own hands in their private chambers. Some sources say it was a single devastating kick to her swollen belly during one of their frequent arguments about his theatrical performances. Others describe a brutal beating that left her hemorrhaging on the marble floor, while Nero, suddenly realizing what he'd done, screamed for physicians who couldn't reverse death, even for a god emperor. The woman who died that day wasn't just any imperial wife. Poppaea Sabina had been Nero's obsession, his muse, the one person who could match his grandiose view of himself. Contemporary accounts describe her as possessing almost supernatural beauty. Amber, colored hair that caught light like spun gold, skin so pale it seemed to glow in the Mediterranean sun. But most distinctively, she had enormous doe-like eyes that Roman poets compared to those of Venus herself. Eyes that seemed to hold depths of mystery and intelligence that captivated the emperor completely. She had been married to Otho, one of Nero's closest friends, when the emperor first saw her at a dinner party. Within months, Nero had banished Otho to a distant province and claimed Poppaea as his own, divorcing his first wife Octavia to marry this woman who understood his artistic pretensions and encouraged his most extravagant fantasies. But here's what most people don't realize about Nero's grief. It wasn't normal human mourning. When you command an empire of 60 million souls, when you've been told since childhood that you're descended from gods, when reality itself bends to your will, the death of your beloved isn't just loss. It's a personal insult from the universe. It's a boundary that dares to exist when you recognize no boundaries. Nero had spent his entire life getting everything he wanted through sheer imperial will. He wanted to be an actor, so he forced senators to applaud his performances. He wanted to race chariots, so he rigged competitions in his favor. He wanted to rebuild Rome according to his vision, so he may have burned half of it down. But death was the one force that wouldn't bow to imperial decree. Nero's response to Poppaea's death shocked even the jaded Roman aristocracy. He refused the traditional cremation, instead having her body embalmed with more spices than the entire Arabian Peninsula produced in a year. He had her corpse dressed in her finest robes and placed in a crystal sarcophagus where he could see her perfectly preserved face. Palace servants reported finding the emperor having full conversations with the body, setting places for her at dinner, asking her opinion on matters of state. The court physicians, those brave or foolish enough to approach him, tried to explain that grief could manifest in strange ways. But Nero wasn't just grieving, he was fracturing. Sleep became impossible without massive doses of poppy wine. He would wake screaming Poppaea's name, convinced he could hear her calling from the next room. Food lost all taste unless it was something she had once enjoyed. He ordered her chambers to be maintained exactly as she had left them, with fresh flowers placed daily and her clothes laid out as if she might return at any moment. It was during this period of imperial madness that fate introduced a young man named Sporus into the story. Sporus was a freedman of Germanic heritage, probably captured as a child during one of the northern campaigns and raised in the imperial household. He was educated, intelligent, and had earned a position of minor responsibility managing some of the palace's domestic affairs. At 17, he possessed the kind of delicate features that were prized in Roman society, with fair skin, light brown hair, and most remarkably, large expressive eyes that seemed to hold an unusual depth of emotion. He was ambitious in the way that only someone born into slavery could be, grateful for his freedom but hungry for the security and status that came with imperial favor. On that fateful day in late 65 AD, Sporus was simply doing his job, overseeing the delivery of new furnishings to one of the palace's guest quarters. He had no idea that his life was about to end and something far more horrifying was about to begin. Nero, wandering the palace in one of his grief-stricken stupors, happened to glance up as Sporus passed through a shaft of afternoon sunlight streaming through the high windows. The light caught the young man's face at just the right angle, illuminating those large, doe-like eyes. And in that instant, Nero saw Poppaea, not a resemblance, not a similarity. In his fractured mind, he saw his dead wife looking back at him through this boy's face. The emperor stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at Sporus with an intensity that made the young man deeply uncomfortable. Other servants in the hallway quickly found reasons to be elsewhere, recognizing the dangerous look in their emperor's eyes. When Nero finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "You, come here." Sporus approached cautiously, probably assuming he had somehow offended the emperor and was about to be punished. But as he drew closer, Nero's expression shifted from grief to something far more terrifying. Recognition mixed with desperate hope, and the kind of manic determination that had driven him to burn half of Rome. "Those eyes," Nero murmured, reaching out to touch Sporus's face with trembling fingers. "Those are her eyes. We have work to do." And with those 6 words, Sporus's fate was sealed. The boy who had walked into that hallway with dreams of advancement and a secure future would never walk out again. What emerged would be something else entirely, a living monument to one man's refusal to accept the finality of death and the terrifying lengths to which unlimited power will go to reshape reality according to its desires. What happened next would haunt the imperial palace for months to come. Nero didn't simply dismiss the court and drag Sporus away to some dungeon. That would have been too crude, too immediate for what the emperor had in mind. Instead, he did something far more chilling. He ordered Sporus to remain exactly where he was, standing in that precise spot where the light from the tall windows caught his features just so. Then Nero summoned his artists. Not just any artists, but the most skilled portraitists in the empire, men who had spent years perfecting their ability to capture not just physical likeness, but the subtle essence of their subjects. Within an hour, the throne room had been transformed into a makeshift studio. Easels appeared as if by magic, along with tablets of wax, charcoal sticks, and measuring instruments that looked more suited to architecture than art. Sporus was forced to stand motionless for hours while these masters of their craft worked feverishly, creating sketch after sketch, study after study. But here's what made the scene truly disturbing. Nero had also ordered servants to bring dozens of existing portraits of Poppaea from throughout the palace. Paintings, busts, relief carvings, even coins bearing her image were arranged in a careful semicircle around the terrified boy. The emperor moved between them like a scholar conducting research, pointing out similarities, noting differences, his voice taking on the detached tone of a natural philosopher examining specimens. "See how the orbital bones are nearly identical," he would murmur to his artists, using a thin bronze rod to indicate specific features on both the portraits of his dead wife and the living face before him. The nose requires adjustment, of course, and the jawline must be refined, but the fundamental architecture is remarkably similar. The artists, seasoned professionals who had painted everyone from senators to gladiators, found themselves in an impossible position. They understood what was being asked of them, and it went against every principle of their craft. Art was meant to capture reality, not to serve as a blueprint for reshaping it. But refusing an emperor's commission wasn't just career suicide, it was actual suicide. So they sketched and measured and made careful notes, all while avoiding eye contact with the boy who stood at the center of this madness. The documentation phase lasted 3 days. 3 days during which Sporus was not allowed to speak, to move, to do anything but serve as a living reference point for Nero's increasingly detailed plans. Servants brought him water and small portions of food, but even these basic necessities were monitored and controlled. The emperor had decreed that his subjects' diet must be carefully regulated to ensure optimal health for the procedures to come. During these 3 days, something insidious began. Nero stopped using Sporus's name entirely. Instead, he referred to him only as my project or the subject or, most chillingly, my beloved. When servants or courtiers forgot and used the boy's actual name, they were sharply corrected. That name no longer exists, Nero would say with casual finality. We are creating something entirely new here. The psychological impact of this systematic erasure cannot be overstated. Identity, particularly in the ancient world, was intimately tied to one's name, one's family, one's place in the social order. By forbidding the use of his name, Nero was effectively announcing that Sporus, the person, was already dead. What remained was merely raw material to be shaped according to the emperor's will. But Nero's attention to detail went far beyond simple name prohibition. He began addressing his captive using feminine pronouns and terms of endearment that had been reserved for Poppaea. My darling, he would coo while examining the boy's profile. My precious one, when discussing surgical modifications with the increasingly horrified physicians he had summoned. Each feminine address was like a small death, a tiny erasure of everything Sporus had been or thought he might become. The medical consultation that followed was unprecedented in Roman history. Nero had summoned not just the imperial physicians, but specialists from across the empire. Greek surgeons known for their skill with delicate procedures, Egyptian doctors versed in cosmetic modifications, even Celtic healers whose knowledge of pain management was legendary. What the emperor proposed to them was revolutionary, terrifying, and completely outside the bounds of normal medical practice. Standard castration, common enough in the Roman world for creating eunuchs, involved the removal of the testicles while leaving the penis intact. It was a straightforward procedure, relatively safe when performed by skilled hands, and served clear social functions in creating trusted servants for wealthy households. But Nero wanted something far more radical. He envisioned a complete reconstruction that would create not just a eunuch, but something approaching a biological female. The surgical plans he outlined would require techniques that pushed the absolute limits of ancient medical knowledge. Internal structures would need to be modified or removed entirely. External anatomy would require careful reshaping to create a convincing feminine appearance. Most challenging of all, some method would need to be devised to create a functional opening that could serve the emperor's conjugal expectations. The physicians found themselves caught between professional ethics and imperial command. Several of the older, more established doctors attempted to explain the impossibility of what was being requested. They spoke of infection risks, of procedures with no precedent, of modifications that could easily prove fatal. Nero listened to their objections with apparent patience, nodding thoughtfully at their medical concerns. Then he calmly explained that their choice was simple. They could attempt the procedures and possibly fail, in which case they would be richly rewarded for their efforts and their silence would be ensured through generous pensions. Or they could refuse, in which case they would be executed immediately and he would find other physicians more willing to push the boundaries of their art. Faced with this ultimatum, even the most principled doctors found ways to rationalize their participation. They told themselves they were advancing medical knowledge, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Some genuinely convinced themselves that they might be able to perform the procedures safely, that their skill could overcome the obvious risks. Others simply accepted that they were trapped and focused on minimizing the harm they would be forced to inflict. The evening before the surgery was scheduled to begin, Nero did something that revealed the true depth of his delusion. He came to the small chamber where Sporus had been confined, carrying a small wooden box that servants recognized immediately. It contained Poppaea's jewelry, pieces she had worn daily, intimate accessories that had never left her presence during their marriage. Nero sat beside his captive on the narrow bed, his manner gentle, almost loving. He spoke in the soft tones he had once used with his wife, as if he were addressing her rather than the terrified boy who had become the focus of his obsession. "Tomorrow, my darling, we begin your journey home to me," he whispered, stroking hair that he had already ordered to be grown long and styled in Poppaea's favored fashion. "I know you're frightened, but there's no need to be. I'm going to take such good care of you." Then he opened the box and withdrew Poppaea's wedding ring. The same ring he had placed on her finger during their marriage ceremony, a band of gold set with pearls that had been crafted specifically for her delicate hands. Nero slipped it onto Sporus's finger, adjusting it carefully because the boy's hands were slightly larger than his wife's had been. Another modification to be addressed in time, the Emperor noted with clinical detachment. But for now, this will serve as a promise. A promise that soon, very soon, you'll be exactly as you were meant to be. The ring was too loose, sliding around on the finger it was never meant to adorn. But Nero seemed not to notice this imperfection, so focused was he on the symbolic significance of the gesture. In his mind, he was reuniting with his beloved wife. In reality, he was placing a funeral ornament on a living victim. That night, as Sporus lay sleepless in his confined quarters, the weight of Poppaea's ring served as a constant reminder of the morning to come. Every movement of his hand caused the band to shift and slide, a physical manifestation of how poorly he fit the role that was being forced upon him. But fitting properly was exactly what the surgery was designed to achieve. By the time the sun rose, the transformation would begin in earnest, and the boy who had once answered to the name Sporus would start his journey toward becoming something else entirely. Something that existed solely to fulfill one man's inability to accept that death was final and love could not be reconstructed through surgery and obsession. The transformation of Sporus didn't begin immediately with surgery. That would come later. First, Nero needed to study his subject to understand every way this boy could be molded into his lost love. For days, Sporus was kept in luxurious chambers adjacent to Nero's own, subjected to endless examinations and measurements. The emperor brought in his most trusted artists, the ones who had painted Poppaea from life. They were ordered to study Sporus and create comparative sketches, noting where he matched the dead empress and where he differed. Nero pored over these studies with the intensity of a scholar examining sacred texts, making notations, planning modifications. But it wasn't just physical appearance Nero was analyzing. He had Sporus speak for hours, listening to his voice, correcting his pronunciation, teaching him Poppaea's distinctive way of drawing out certain vowels. He tested the boy's walk, his gestures, the way he held his hands when sitting. Every deviation from Poppaea's mannerisms was noted for correction. The psychological torture had already begun. Sporus was forbidden to use his own name. Servants were instructed to address him as lady or mistress. His simple tunics were replaced with flowing stolas in Poppaea's favorite colors. He was taught to apply cosmetics, not the simple touches appropriate for a Roman youth, but the elaborate makeup of a noble woman. Can you imagine waking up each morning, looking in the polished bronze mirror, and seeing your own face being systematically erased? The servants who attended Sporus during this period later reported that he barely spoke, barely ate, moved through his days like someone in a waking nightmare. But he didn't resist. How could he? One word of complaint would mean death or worse. Because by now, Sporus had learned what Nero intended. The emperor hadn't hidden his plans. In fact, he spoke of them openly, excitedly, like an artist describing a masterpiece in progress. The physicians had been consulted. The procedure had been explained. Sporus was going to be physically transformed into a woman through castration and surgical modification. This wasn't just removing masculinity. Roman eunuchs were common enough in certain roles. This was something unprecedented. An attempt to surgically create a woman from a man, to rebuild Sporus's body into an approximation of feminine form. The physicians, threatened with death if they refused and promised immense rewards if they succeeded, had devised procedures that went far beyond simple castration. They planned to reshape his face, soften his features through careful cutting and healing. They would use techniques borrowed from Egyptian embalmers to preserve and modify tissue. They spoke of creating curves where nature had made angles, of using padding and binding to simulate feminine proportions. The night before the surgery, Nero visited Sporus in his chambers. The emperor was almost giddy with anticipation, speaking of wedding plans, of how they would tour the Greek cities as man and wife. He described the ceremonies they would attend, the banquets where Sporus would sit beside him as empress. Nero had already commissioned wedding garments, a bridal crown that had once belonged to Poppaea herself. He spoke of legitimizing their union through proper Roman ritual, as if the gods themselves would bless this grotesque parody of marriage. The emperor's delusion was so complete that he genuinely seemed to believe he was rescuing Sporus, elevating him to the highest position in the empire. In Nero's twisted mind, this wasn't cruelty but the greatest gift imaginable. The transformation surgery took place over several days, with Sporus kept unconscious through a combination of opium and mandragora. When he finally awoke, bandaged and barely recognizable even to himself, Nero was there waiting. The emperor's first words were not to ask about pain or healing, but to whisper Poppeia's name and stroke what remained of Sporus's altered features. The recovery period became another layer of psychological conditioning. Sporus was surrounded by items that had belonged to Poppaea, her jewelry, her perfumes, her personal effects. Nero would spend hours describing memories of his dead wife, expecting Sporus to nod and smile as if these were shared experiences. The emperor brought in Poppeia's former servants, women who had dressed her hair and selected her clothing, and they were ordered to treat Sporus exactly as they had treated their former mistress. These women, terrified for their own lives, played along with the charade, but their discomfort was obvious. They would glance nervously at each other when forced to address this mutilated boy as Augusta, the title reserved for the emperor's wife. Some wept silently as they applied makeup to features that had been carved into an approximation of femininity. The physical pain of healing was nothing compared to the psychological torture of being forced to inhabit someone else's identity. Sporus was required to study Poppeia's correspondence, to learn her handwriting, to memorize her preferences in food and entertainment. He practiced her laugh until it became automatic, rehearsed her way of tilting her head when listening to music. Every natural impulse had to be suppressed, every genuine reaction replaced with a performance of someone else's personality. The most horrifying aspect was how Nero's delusion seemed to deepen as the performance improved. The better Sporus became at mimicking Poppaea, the more convinced the emperor became that his beloved had somehow returned to him. Nero would forget, for hours at a time, that this was an elaborate construction. He would speak to Sporus of events from before the surgery as if they had experienced them together in their previous life. When reality would intrude, when some gesture or expression broke the illusion, Nero's rage was terrifying. He would scream at Sporus to remember, to be who he was supposed to be, as if the boy was willfully choosing to forget a past that had never belonged to him. The wedding ceremony itself took place in 67 AD, conducted with all the pomp and ritual of a legitimate imperial marriage. Sporus, dressed in Poppeia's own wedding garments, stood beside Nero as priests performed the ancient rites. The guests, senators and courtiers who valued their lives, attended and offered congratulations with faces that betrayed nothing of their horror. They toasted the health of the new Augusta, raised their cups to celebrate a union that mocked every tradition of Roman marriage. The wedding feast lasted 3 days, with Sporus seated at Nero's right hand, smiling and nodding as the emperor regaled the assembled guests with stories of their courtship and love. It was theater performed at the point of a sword, a collective madness that everyone participated in because the alternative was death. And through it all, Sporus played his part perfectly. Having learned that survival depended on never breaking character, never allowing his true self to surface even for a moment, he had become the architect of his own prison, building the bars that confined him with every successful performance of being someone else. The transformation of Sporus into Nero's twisted vision of Poppaea represents one of history's most disturbing examples of systematic psychological destruction. What began as physical mutilation evolved into something far more sinister, a complete erasure of human identity that would ultimately drive its victim to the very edge of sanity. In the months following his surgery, palace servants began reporting strange sounds emanating from Sporus' chambers at night. Guards stationed outside described hearing conversations, but when they investigated, they found only Sporus alone, speaking to his reflection in the polished bronze mirrors that lined his walls. These weren't the rambling monologues of someone practicing speeches or rehearsing court etiquette. According to fragmentary accounts preserved in the memoirs of a palace physician, Sporus appeared to be engaged in actual dialogues, pausing as if listening to responses, arguing with invisible companions, sometimes pleading with his own reflection as if it were a separate person entirely. The physician, whose name has been lost to history but whose observations survived in later compilations, noted that Sporus seemed to have developed what we might now recognize as dissociative identity disorder. He would speak in different voices. Sometimes his original masculine tone would break through the carefully trained feminine register, creating jarring conversations between his imposed identity and fragments of his true self. During one particularly disturbing episode witnessed by a servant bringing evening wine, Sporus was found standing before a large mirror, tears streaming down his face, speaking in Popeye's voice to his reflection while simultaneously responding in his own natural voice. The conversation, as recorded by the terrified servant, went something like this. Popeye's voice would coo, "You look beautiful tonight, my dear," while Sporus' real voice would respond desperately, "I am not beautiful, I am dying." This psychological fragmentation wasn't accidental. It was the inevitable result of a mind trying to survive impossible circumstances by literally splitting itself apart. When reality becomes unbearable, the human psyche sometimes creates alternate realities, separate identities that can endure what the original self cannot. For Sporus, becoming Popeye wasn't just a performance anymore, it had become a psychological refuge, a place where he could exist without feeling the full weight of his violation. But this refuge came at a terrible cost. The boundaries between his true self and his imposed identity began to blur beyond recognition, creating a psychological prison far more effective than any physical chains. By 68 AD, the Roman Empire was fracturing under the weight of Nero's increasingly erratic rule. Rebellions erupted across the provinces as governors and generals finally found the courage to openly defy an emperor who had become more liability than leader. In Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex raised the standard of revolt, followed quickly by Servius Sulpicius Galba in Spain. The Praetorian Guard, long the backbone of imperial power, began to waver in their loyalty as it became clear that Nero's reign was entering its final phase. When news reached Rome that the Senate had declared Nero a public enemy and condemned him to death by flogging, the emperor's world collapsed entirely. But even in his final desperate flight from the capital, Nero couldn't abandon his obsession. As he prepared to flee to his freedman Faun's villa outside the city, he insisted that Sporus accompany him, along with only a handful of his most loyal servants. The journey to Faun's villa was a surreal nightmare of fallen grandeur. The man who had once commanded legions and ruled an empire spanning 3 continents now traveled in disguise, his face covered, jumping at every sound that might signal pursuing soldiers. And beside him rode Sporus, still dressed as Popeye, still playing the role of devoted wife even as their world crumbled around them. At the villa, as reports arrived that Roman cavalry was closing in, Nero's behavior became increasingly frantic. He paced the small rooms, alternately weeping and raging, sometimes addressing Sporus as if he were actually Popeye, seeking comfort from his dead wife through her living impersonator. "My beloved," he would whisper, clutching Sporus' hands. "We will escape this together, as we always have." Then, moments later, the delusion would crack, and he would stare at Sporus with wild eyes, perhaps seeing him clearly for the first time in months, before the madness descended again. As the sound of approaching horses grew closer, Nero made his final decision. Death was inevitable, but he would control the manner of his departure from the world. In keeping with his theatrical nature, he began preparing for an elaborate suicide, complete with dramatic final words and carefully choreographed gestures. But even in death, he couldn't release his hold on Sporus. As Nero prepared the dagger that would end his life, he turned to Sporus with a request that encapsulated the entire horrific relationship. He wanted Sporus to help guide the blade, to participate in the suicide as Popeye would have done, mourning and supporting her husband in his final moments. The scene that followed was both tragic and deeply disturbing. Sporus, still trapped in his role, performed the part of the grieving wife, weeping over Nero as the emperor positioned the dagger at his throat. When Nero's nerve failed him at the crucial moment, it was Sporus who, in what might have been his only act of mercy in years, helped push the blade home. Nero's last words, according to Suetonius, were, "What an artist dies in me," but those who were present claimed he also whispered something to Sporus, something that sounded like, "Now you are free." Whether this was genuine remorse or simply another layer of the performance, we will never know. What we do know is that Sporus of freedom would prove to be an illusion. In the chaos following Nero's death, he would discover that escaping one captor only meant falling into the hands of others, each with their own twisted plans for the young man who had been transformed into the ghost of an empress. The death of Nero marked the end of one chapter in Sporus' nightmare, but far from being the conclusion of his suffering, it was merely the beginning of a new, and perhaps even more horrifying phase. In the coming months, as Rome descended into civil war and emperors rose and fell with terrifying frequency, Sporus would learn that his transformation had made him not just a victim, but a valuable commodity in the brutal politics of imperial succession. The wedding preparations were grotesque in their normalcy. Wedding planners consulted ancient texts to ensure every traditional ritual was perfectly executed, as if the legitimacy of ceremony could somehow transform the underlying horror into something sacred. The palace buzzed with activity that would have been familiar at any imperial wedding throughout Roman history. Yet every detail carried an undertone of madness that made even hardened courtiers uncomfortable. Seamstresses worked day and night creating a wedding dress that would rival any worn by previous empresses, using silk imported from the far reaches of the empire and pearls from the Red Sea. The irony was not lost on those forced to participate that they were crafting the most elaborate costume in what had become Rome's most disturbing theatrical performance. Nero threw himself into the planning with the enthusiasm of a man organizing the social event of the century rather than the formalization of his psychological breakdown. He personally selected every flower arrangement, tasted every dish that would be served at the wedding feast, and even composed new songs to be performed during the ceremony. The emperor's attention to detail was obsessive, as if the perfection of external elements could somehow validate the fundamental impossibility of what he was attempting to achieve. What made this spectacle particularly chilling was how efficiently the Roman state apparatus adapted to serve Nero's delusion. Legal scholars were consulted to draft marriage contracts that would officially recognize Sporus as Poppaea Sabina, complete with inheritance rights and imperial privileges. The documentation required creative legal fiction that pushed Roman jurisprudence into uncharted territory, creating precedents that existed solely to accommodate one man's refusal to accept reality. Court artists were commissioned to create official portraits of the happy couple, working from life to capture what they diplomatically described as the Empress's renewed radiance after her recovery from a mysterious illness. These paintings would hang in government buildings across the empire, forcing provincial administrators to display images of what they knew to be an elaborate lie. The wedding invitations themselves represented a masterpiece of bureaucratic doublethink, written in language that managed to be both formally correct and completely divorced from truth. Recipients were expected to respond with congratulations and gift selections as if they were celebrating a normal imperial union rather than participating in the emperor's psychological collapse. The guest list read like a catalog of Roman political survival, including senators who had no choice but to attend and smile while watching their empire's leader marry his surgically altered teenage captive. Each invitation carried an implicit threat, the understanding that absence would be interpreted as political disloyalty rather than moral objection. In the weeks leading up to the ceremony, Sporus was subjected to an intensified version of his ongoing ordeal. Wedding preparation became another layer of his performance, requiring him to display the appropriate mixture of bridal excitement and imperial dignity. He was tutored in the specific gestures and expressions expected of a Roman bride, from the ritualistic resistance to leaving her father's house to the modest joy appropriate for a woman of noble birth. The coaching sessions were particularly cruel because they demanded emotional authenticity in service of complete fabrication. Sporus had to practice blushing at compliments, giggling at appropriate moments, and displaying the nervous anticipation that would be natural for any young woman about to become empress. The wedding dress fittings became exercises in psychological torture, as seamstresses adjusted fabric around a body that had been surgically altered to accommodate Nero's vision. Every pin placement and hem adjustment served as a reminder of the violence that had been done to transform him into this living doll. The most disturbing aspect was how Nero genuinely seemed to believe he was giving Sporus the wedding that Poppaea had deserved, treating the elaborate preparations as a gift rather than an extension of his captivity. The emperor would sit in on dress fittings with the satisfied smile of a man who had found the perfect solution to an impossible problem. The wedding day itself, held in early 67 AD, represented the complete breakdown of the boundary between private delusion and public policy. Hundreds of Rome's most powerful citizens gathered in the palace to witness what everyone knew was a charade, but no one dared acknowledge as such. The ceremony proceeded with all the traditional elements of Roman imperial weddings, from the taking of auspices to determine divine approval to the formal exchange of rings and vows. Religious officials performed their roles with the mechanical precision of men who had learned that survival depended on treating the impossible as routine. The wedding feast that followed was a surreal experience for all involved, as guests toasted the health and happiness of a union that existed only in the emperor's fractured mind. Conversation flowed around topics like the couple's future children and their plans for domestic happiness, words that hung in the air like incense from a desecrated temple. Musicians performed love songs composed specifically for the occasion, their melodies carrying lyrics that praised the bride's beauty and the groom's devotion with the hollow ring of propaganda. The wedding gifts presented by nervous senators and foreign dignitaries would later fill rooms in the palace, expensive offerings to a marriage that was simultaneously completely real and utterly fictional. Throughout it all, Sporus performed his role with the mechanical perfection that had been beaten into him over months of preparation. His smiles never faltered, his responses never missed their cues, and his gratitude for this honor never appeared anything less than genuine. Yet those who looked closely could see the deadness behind his eyes, the expression of someone who had learned that survival depended on the complete suppression of authentic response. The wedding night that followed would be mercifully private, but the marriage itself had become a matter of public record, officially transforming Rome's most elaborate victim into its newest empress. This ceremony marked not just the formalization of Nero's delusion, but the moment when the entire Roman state became complicit in maintaining a fiction that everyone knew was destroying an innocent young man. The wedding had succeeded in making Sporus legally Poppaea, but it had also made every witness an accessory to one of history's most elaborate forms of psychological torture. The morning routine began before dawn in the opulent chambers that had once belonged to Poppaea Sabina. Sporus would wake surrounded by her possessions, her perfumes still lingering in the air, her jewelry glinting in the early light filtering through silk curtains. The same servants who had once dressed the real Poppaea now performed their duties on her replacement, their faces carefully neutral as they applied cosmetics to masculine features, styled hair that would never quite fall the same way, and draped silk stolas over a frame that had been surgically altered to approximate feminine curves. Every morning was a resurrection of the dead, performed by trembling hands on a living victim. The servants knew the truth, of course, but speaking it meant death. So they painted and powdered and perfumed in silence, creating each day the illusion that their beloved former mistress had somehow returned from the grave. Public appearances were perhaps the cruelest aspect of Sporus's existence as Nero's empress. The emperor insisted on displaying his creation everywhere, from the grand spectacles at the Colosseum to intimate dinner parties with foreign dignitaries. Sporus learned to move with the gliding gait expected of Roman noblewomen, to hold his head at the proper angle, to gesture with studied grace. Every step was choreographed, every smile calculated, every word measured against the memory of a dead woman's voice. At the theater, he sat in the empress's box, while thousands of Roman citizens craned their necks to stare at this impossible creature. The whispers followed him everywhere, a constant susurrus of speculation and horror that he pretended not to hear. Some spectators wept openly at the sight, whether from pity or revulsion, while others laughed nervously at what they assumed must be an elaborate imperial joke. But Nero's deadly serious demeanor made it clear that this was no jest, and the laughter quickly died in their throats. The races at the Circus Maximus became exercises in endurance as Sporus sat motionless for hours, maintaining perfect posture while 250,000 Romans watched his every movement. He learned to eat delicately at state banquets, to applaud at the correct moments during performances, to receive foreign ambassadors with the dignity expected of Caesar's wife. Each public appearance was a masterclass in psychological torture, forcing him to perform normalcy, while his very existence was a violation of nature and human dignity. The Greek tour of 67 AD represented the pinnacle of this elaborate charade. Nero, convinced of his own artistic genius, embarked on a grand cultural expedition to compete in the Olympic Games and various artistic competitions throughout Greece. Naturally, he brought his empress along, and the Greeks, eager to curry favor with their Roman overlords, treated Sporus with all the deference due to an Augusta. He presided over banquets in Athens, attended poetry recitations in Delphi, and watched his husband compete in chariot races while wearing the crown and robes of imperial authority. The Greeks, masters of theater themselves, seemed to understand the performance better than the Romans. They praised Sporus's beauty, complimented his grace, and spoke of the obvious love between the imperial couple with the same skill they brought to their tragic dramas. But behind their diplomatic smiles, even they recognized the profound wrongness of what they were witnessing. Between public appearances, Sporus lived in a strange liminal space between privilege and captivity. As Nero's wife, he enjoyed access to luxuries beyond imagination: fine silks from China, pearls from the Red Sea, delicacies from every corner of the empire. His quarters were appointed with priceless art, his table set with gold and silver, his bath scented with oils worth more than most Romans earned in a lifetime. Yet every luxury came with invisible chains. He could not leave the palace grounds without escort. He could not speak to anyone without supervision. He could not even be alone with his own thoughts, as Nero demanded constant companionship and conversation. The emperor's love, if it could be called that, was possessive and consuming. Nero would spend hours staring at his creation, comparing him to portraits of Poppaea, adjusting his hair or makeup, critiquing his posture or expression. Sometimes he would weep with joy at the resemblance, other times rage at the differences that no amount of surgery or cosmetics could completely erase. The most disturbing moments came when Nero spoke to Sporus, as if he truly were Poppaea, reminiscing about shared memories that belonged to a dead woman. He would reference conversations they had never had, places they had never visited together, intimate moments that existed only in the emperor's fractured mind. Sporus learned to nod and smile, to play along with these delusions, because contradiction brought swift and terrible punishment. Gradually, the line between performance and reality began to blur in his own mind. After months of being called by another's name, wearing another's clothes, living another's life, Sporus began to lose track of where the performance ended and he began. Servants reported finding him practicing Poppaea's mannerisms even when alone, speaking to himself in her voice, studying her portraits with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Whether this was a survival mechanism or the beginning of genuine psychological fracture, no one could say. But the boy who had once been Sporus was disappearing, replaced by something that was neither male nor female, neither slave nor free, neither living nor dead. He existed in a twilight realm of imperial madness, sustained by the whims of a tyrant who had confused love with possession, resurrection with replacement, and creation with destruction. The Roman court watched this slow motion tragedy unfold with a mixture of fascination and horror, knowing that they too were trapped in Nero's web of delusion. To acknowledge the truth would mean death, so they continued to smile and bow and pretend that the emperor's wife was exactly what she appeared to be. In doing so, they became complicit in one of history's most elaborate and sustained acts of psychological torture. The spring of 68 AD marked the beginning of the end for Nero's reign, but for Sporus, it represented something far more complex than the fall of an empire. It was the moment when years of carefully constructed delusion would finally collide with the harsh reality of a crumbling world. As rebellions erupted across the Roman territories and the Senate declared Nero an enemy of the state, the emperor's grip on power dissolved with shocking speed. Yet even as his political authority evaporated, Nero's psychological hold over Sporus remained as strong as ever. The signs had been building for months, though Nero in his increasing madness had chosen to ignore them. Provincial governors openly defied imperial orders, the treasury stood nearly empty from years of extravagant spending, and whispers of conspiracy echoed through the palace corridors. But perhaps most telling was the behavior of the Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers whose loyalty had always been the bedrock of imperial power. When they finally abandoned Nero, refusing to defend the palace against approaching rebel forces, the emperor's fate was sealed. For Sporus, watching this collapse unfold was like witnessing the destruction of his entire universe. His existence had become so thoroughly defined by Nero's needs and delusions that the prospect of the emperor's fall raised terrifying questions about his own survival. What would happen to someone who had been surgically and psychologically transformed to fulfill one man's obsession, when that man no longer held the power to protect his creation? The palace that had been his prison for 3 years suddenly felt even more precarious as servants fled and courtiers melted away like snow in spring sunshine. Those who remained moved through the marble halls with the nervous energy of people preparing for catastrophe, packing valuables and burning documents that might implicate them in the regime's excesses. Yet through it all, Nero insisted on maintaining the fiction of normalcy, still expecting Sporus to dress as Poppaea, still demanding the performance of loving devotion even as the world crumbled around them. When Nero finally accepted that Rome was lost to him, his decision to flee the city created a new nightmare for Sporus. The emperor's small group of remaining loyalists included his secretary Epaphroditus, a few faithful freedmen, and of course, his beloved artificial wife. Even facing death or exile, Nero could not conceive of abandoning the person he believed to be Poppaea reborn. The journey to the villa outside Rome, where they would make their final stand, was a surreal experience that pushed both emperor and victim further into psychological extremes. Nero alternated between grandiose fantasies of escape to Egypt or Gaul, where he imagined rebuilding his empire, and theatrical preparations for a dramatic suicide that would secure his place in history. Throughout these wild swings of mood and planning, he continued to treat Sporus as his legitimate empress, consulting him on decisions and seeking comfort in embraces that represented the ultimate violation of consent. For Sporus, these final days represented a peculiar form of liberation and torment combined. The collapse of imperial structure meant that the rigid daily routines of performance were breaking down, yet this also meant that Nero's attention became even more intensely focused on his artificial companion. Without the distractions of governance and court ceremony, the emperor poured all his remaining emotional energy into maintaining his delusion about Poppaea's resurrection. Witnesses later reported that, during this period, Nero's behavior toward Sporus became even more erratic and possessive. He would spend hours staring at his creation, as if trying to memorize every detail of the face that had been surgically altered to match his dead wife's features. Sometimes he would weep and beg Poppaea's forgiveness for failing to protect their empire, addressing Sporus with desperate intensity that revealed the depth of his psychological dependence. The final scene of this 3-year tragedy played out in a modest villa on the outskirts of Rome, where Nero's last supporters had gathered to await either rescue or doom. As news arrived that the Senate had condemned him to death by flogging, and that soldiers were approaching to carry out the sentence, Nero made his final decision to choose suicide over capture. Even in this moment of ultimate crisis, he could not abandon his delusion about Sporus's identity. The emperor insisted that his beloved Poppaea should be present for his death, should witness his final performance as the misunderstood artist, emperor who had loved too deeply and lost everything. What followed was perhaps the most disturbing scene in an already horrific story. Nero, trembling with fear and unable to drive the dagger into his own throat, turned to Sporus for assistance. But he didn't simply ask for help with his suicide. He demanded that Poppaea help guide his hand, that she perform the final act of wifely devotion by helping him achieve a noble death. For Sporus, this moment represented both the culmination of his torment and perhaps his only opportunity to perform a genuinely merciful act. After 3 years of being forced to participate in elaborate psychological torture, he could finally do something that might end both their suffering. Historical accounts suggest that as Sporus helped steady the blade against Nero's throat, the emperor's final words were expressions of love and gratitude to his artificial Poppaea. Even in death, Nero maintained the delusion that had destroyed 2 lives and traumatized everyone who witnessed its unfolding. The irony was profound. Sporus's first and perhaps only act of genuine agency in 3 years was helping to kill the man who had created him, and in doing so, he may have performed the most merciful act possible under the circumstances. When the blade finally found its mark and Nero's blood flowed onto the villa floor, Sporus was left staring at the corpse of his tormentor, still dressed in Poppeia's clothes, still wearing her jewelry, still trapped in an identity that was never his own. The emperor was dead, but his creation remained, a living testament to the depths of human cruelty and the terrible power of unchecked authority to reshape reality according to its own twisted desires. The collapse of Nero's empire in 68 AD should have marked the end of Sporus's nightmare, but instead, it merely transformed his torment into something even more complex and devastating. As rebellion spread across the provinces and the Senate finally declared Nero an enemy of the state, the emperor fled Rome with his closest companions, including the transformed young man who had become his most prized possession. During those final desperate weeks, witnesses described scenes of almost theatrical pathos as Nero clung to Sporus with increasing desperation. The emperor, who had once commanded legions and controlled the fate of millions, now found himself reduced to a fugitive hiding in a suburban villa, still demanding that his creation maintain the elaborate fiction they had constructed together. Even as messengers brought news of approaching cavalry and certain capture, Nero insisted that Sporus continue the daily rituals of imperial wifehood, applying cosmetics with trembling hands and arranging the elaborate hairstyles that had become his prison. The psychological dynamics of those final days reveal something profound about the nature of their relationship and the complete breakdown of both men's grip on reality. Nero, facing the collapse of everything he had built, seemed to retreat even deeper into the delusion that Sporus was truly Poppaea returned to him. He spoke to his companion as if addressing his dead wife, asking for forgiveness for past failures and promising a glorious afterlife together in the manner of tragic lovers from Greek drama. For Sporus, these final weeks represented perhaps the most psychologically complex period of his entire ordeal. After years of forced performance, the boundaries between his authentic self and his imposed identity had become so blurred that even he seemed uncertain where one ended and the other began. Contemporary accounts describe him responding to Nero's desperate endearments with what appeared to be genuine affection, though whether this represented Stockholm Syndrome, complete psychological breakdown, or simply the continuation of a survival strategy remains a matter of historical debate. When the end finally came, it arrived with the same theatrical flourish that had characterized Nero's entire reign, surrounded by his few remaining loyal servants in a modest villa outside Rome. The emperor who had once declared himself a god faced the ultimate human limitation. As he pressed a dagger to his throat with trembling hands, Nero made one final demand of his creation. He asked Sporus to begin the ritual lamentations that a Roman wife would perform for her deceased husband, to mourn him as Poppaea would have mourned. And in that moment, as Sporus helped guide the blade that would end both their suffering, he perhaps performed the only genuinely merciful act in their entire twisted relationship. With Nero's death, most observers assumed that Sporus's nightmare had finally ended, but the reality proved far more complex. The young man had become something unprecedented in Roman society, a living symbol of imperial excess whose very existence posed uncomfortable questions about power, identity, and the nature of humanity itself. Rather than freedom, Nero's death simply transferred ownership of this human curiosity to whoever could claim power next. The year of 4 emperors that followed Nero's suicide created a grotesque auction for Sporus's fate, as each successive claimant to the throne viewed him through the lens of their own ambitions and psychological needs. First came Galba, the elderly general whose military reputation had made him the Senate's choice to restore order to the empire. Galba treated Sporus with the cold courtesy one might show a valuable but distasteful inheritance, keeping him in the palace but largely ignoring his existence. For several months, Sporus lived in a strange twilight state, still dressed in women's clothing because after years of transformation, what alternative did he have? Still addressed by Poppeia's name because no one seemed to remember or care about his original identity. But without the intense focus of Nero's obsession, he existed in a kind of limbo, neither fully alive nor entirely dead to the world. This brief respite ended abruptly when Galba was murdered in the Forum after only 7 months of rule, and power passed to Otho, a man whose connection to this story ran deeper than mere political succession. Otho had been married to Poppaea Sabina before Nero stole her away, making his interest in Sporus particularly disturbing and psychologically complex. Did he see in the transformed young man an echo of his lost love, a chance to reclaim something that had been taken from him, or perhaps an opportunity for revenge against Nero's memory? Historical sources suggest that Otho treated Sporus as a legitimate widow, even going so far as to promise marriage and restoration to imperial status. The psychological implications of this proposal are staggering when considered fully. Here was a man seeking to marry the surgically altered victim of his predecessor's obsession with his own former wife, creating layers of exploitation and delusion that boggle the modern mind. Fortunately for Sporus, Otho's reign proved even briefer than Galba's. After losing the decisive battle of Bedriacum to the forces of Vitellius, Otho chose suicide rather than prolonged civil war. And once again Sporus found himself transferred, like a piece of valuable property, to a new master. Vitellius represented a different kind of emperor entirely. Crude and gluttonous where Nero had been refined and artistic, caring nothing for the sophisticated cruelties that had characterized the previous regime. To Vitellius, Sporus was neither a person deserving of consideration nor a valuable object to be preserved, but simply a potential source of entertainment for the Roman mob whose support he desperately needed to maintain his precarious grip on power. It was under Vitellius that Sporus's story reached its final, most brutal chapter, as the emperor announced a plan that would have horrified even Nero in its calculated cruelty. Sporus would be forced to perform in a public spectacle in the Colosseum, not as a privileged spectator in the imperial box, but as a participant in the deadly games that entertained the masses. The plan revealed a hideously creative mind at work, designed to extract maximum entertainment value from years of accumulated suffering. Sporus would be compelled to reenact the myth of Proserpina, the innocent maiden abducted by Pluto to rule as queen of the underworld. In this fatal performance, he would be seized by gladiators dressed as demons and subjected to public rape before being killed for the amusement of thousands of spectators. The symbolism was as deliberate as it was cruel, casting Sporus as the eternal victim whose suffering would provide cathartic entertainment for the mob, while simultaneously serving as a final humiliation of Nero's memory. When news of this planned spectacle reached Sporus, something fundamental shifted in his psychology after years of passive endurance. Perhaps it was the prospect of having his private torment transformed into public entertainment, or maybe the realization that death in the arena would represent the complete erasure of any human dignity he had managed to preserve. Whatever the catalyst, Sporus finally found the strength that had eluded him throughout years of systematic dehumanization. Rather than submit to this final degradation, he chose death on his own terms, marking perhaps the first truly autonomous decision he had been able to make since that fateful day when Nero first recognized Poppaea's eyes in his face. The exact method of his suicide remains debated among historical sources, with some suggesting poison while others describe the traditional Roman method of opening one's veins. But all accounts agree on the essential fact that Sporus died by his own hand, finally escaping the role that had been forced upon him and reclaiming, in death, the agency that had been denied him in life. In choosing suicide over spectacle, Sporus transformed what was meant to be his final humiliation into his first act of genuine self-determination, turning death itself into a form of freedom that no emperor could take away. The tragedy of Sporus raises profound questions that echo across 2 millennia, challenging our understanding of identity, autonomy, and the devastating corruption that absolute power can unleash upon the human soul. Here was a person systematically destroyed and rebuilt to serve another's delusion, a living testament to how completely one human being can be erased and reconstituted to fulfill the twisted fantasies of those who wield unlimited authority. Every aspect of his existence, physical, psychological, social, was violated and reshaped with methodical precision that would make modern torturers envious of Nero's thoroughness. The emperor didn't simply want to possess Sporus or even to transform him, but to completely replace his very essence with that of another person entirely. Sporus became a living ghost, forced to impersonate someone he had never met, compelled to love the very person who had destroyed everything he once was. This wasn't merely physical abuse or even psychological manipulation, but something far more sinister, the complete erasure of one human being's existence to create space for the resurrection of another. What makes his story particularly haunting is how completely we have lost the real Sporus, the person who existed before that fateful day when Nero's attention fell upon him like a death sentence disguised as divine favor. We don't know his thoughts, his dreams, his personality, his hopes for the future, or even the simple details of his daily life before he became the emperor's obsession. Did he have friends among the other young freedmen in the palace, sharing jokes and complaints about their duties? Did he harbor secret ambitions to rise in the imperial administration, perhaps dreaming of earning enough to buy property or start a family? Was he homesick for whatever distant province had been his birthplace, carrying memories of a childhood before Rome claimed him? That person was so thoroughly erased that even his original name remains uncertain to us, lost in the deliberate destruction of his former identity. The name Sporus itself might have been nothing more than a cruel nickname, derived from the Greek word for seed or sown thing, emphasizing his transformation from one form into another like some grotesque agricultural metaphor. The boy who entered Nero's presence that day effectively ceased to exist, replaced by a performance that would continue without interruption until death finally released him from his role. This wasn't a gradual change or even a violent transformation, but something more akin to murder, the killing of one person to make room for the artificial creation of another. Every morning when Sporus woke in Poppaea's chambers, surrounded by her belongings and expected to inhabit her memories, he faced the daily death of his authentic self. The mirrors that lined those rooms reflected back not his face, but a carefully constructed lie that everyone around him was required to accept as truth. His voice, trained to match Poppaea's cadences and inflections, spoke words that weren't his own, expressed emotions he had never felt, recounted memories of experiences he had never lived. Even his body had been altered to serve this fiction, surgically modified to better accommodate Nero's delusion that love could conquer death, and that human beings were merely clay to be reshaped according to imperial will. The physicians who performed these unprecedented procedures weren't pioneering medical techniques to heal or improve life, but rather serving as instruments of a systematic campaign to destroy one person's physical reality and replace it with something that existed only in a madman's grief-stricken imagination. Modern historians debate whether Sporus ever experienced genuine moments of agency within his captivity, searching through the limited historical record for evidence that some spark of his true self survived the comprehensive assault on his identity. Some scholars point to his final suicide as his one true act of self-determination, the moment when he finally reclaimed control over his own existence by choosing to end it rather than submit to yet another degrading performance. Others note smaller acts of resistance scattered throughout his captivity, the moments when his real voice broke through the carefully constructed facade, the desperate escape attempt that nearly succeeded, and perhaps most significantly, his choice to help Nero die rather than prolonging the emperor's life and extending his own torment. These tiny rebellions, if that's what they were, represent cracks in the perfect performance that Nero had demanded, brief glimpses of the person who still existed somewhere beneath the elaborate costume of imperial delusion. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Sporus's story isn't Nero's individual cruelty, horrific as it was, but rather how many people became complicit in his systematic torture. The physicians who performed the surgery had to make a conscious choice to use their healing skills for mutilation, violating every principle of their profession to serve imperial madness. The tutors who trained him in feminine deportment and speech weren't teaching valuable skills, but rather participating in the methodical destruction of a young person's authentic identity. The courtiers who pretended he was Poppaea, who complimented his appearance and deferred to his supposed imperial status, were actively maintaining a fiction they knew to be both false and harmful. The servants who dressed him each day, who arranged his hair in Poppaea's style and painted his face to match her remembered beauty, were participating in a daily ritual of dehumanization. Hundreds of people throughout the imperial household participated in maintaining this cruel fiction, each of them making the calculated choice to prioritize their own survival over the humanity of a teenage boy. They weren't passive bystanders but active collaborators, their silence and participation making Nero's delusion possible and sustainable over the years it continued. The guards who prevented his escape attempts, the slaves who reported any signs of resistance, the freedmen who treated him as papaya rather than acknowledging his true identity, all of them bear responsibility for the continuation of his suffering. This wasn't ignorance or misunderstanding, but willful participation in an obvious lie that everyone involved knew was destroying a human being for the psychological comfort of their emperor. The story of Sporus serves as a chilling reminder that power, without conscience, creates horrors beyond imagination, transforming entire societies into accomplices in the systematic destruction of individual human dignity. When reality itself becomes subject to the whims of authority, when human beings become raw material for others' fantasies, when entire communities participate in obvious fictions to appease tyrants, the results are invariably tragic and the responsibility extends far beyond the primary perpetrator. In the grand narrative of Roman history, Sporus is often reduced to a footnote, just another colorful example of Nero's well-documented excesses, rather than being recognized as a human being whose life was stolen and whose suffering deserves to be remembered. But he was a person with inherent dignity and worth, someone whose identity was erased, whose body was mutilated, whose every waking moment became a performance in someone else's tragedy. He deserves to be remembered not just as a victim of imperial cruelty, but as a person who endured unimaginable circumstances with whatever grace he could manage, and who finally, in his last act, chose freedom over further degradation. The ruins of Nero's palace still stand in Rome today, buried beneath centuries of later construction, but still present beneath the modern city's foundations. Somewhere in those ruins are the chambers where Sporus lived his stolen life, where he stood before mirrors that reflected back a stranger, where he practiced speaking in a voice that wasn't his own. The stones remember, even if history has largely forgotten, the boy who was forced to become a ghost, who lived and died in service to a delusion that should never have been permitted to destroy a human life. His story challenges us to consider how we respond when power demands that we participate in obvious lies, and whether we have the courage to recognize and defend human dignity even when it's inconvenient or dangerous to do so.